Test.
Listen, I guess it is. I guess.
You probably should use this. However that works.
In the middle of the table.
All right.
There we go.
There we go.
Can you hear me now?
All right.
Okay. So Sid, buddy of mine for the last 25 years. In fact, he just had his 25-year celebration as pastor here at Trinity, although most of that time they were over at 50th and Evans or something. And but they moved in here, and we rent a room from them. We give our lectures here. We have our parties here. They're very friendly to atheists and other heathens. And Sid and I have given a couple of classes together, Bible studies for skeptics. And so we thought it would be interesting to explore the concepts of evolution. Last Sunday, you had your Evolution Sunday. Mm-hmm. So every year for around Darwin Day time, he goes into his, I don't know, it's probably a different thing every year.
A little bit.
Yeah, a little bit different. And I'm usually not up on Sunday mornings to participate in that.
It's all right.
But I usually like to tell people about my first encounter with evolution in high school biology in Houston, Texas. The biology teacher said, there's this thing called evolution you may have heard about. There's books about it that you can read if you're interested. End of topic.
Wow.
I had it in Sunday school in the same time frame. A husband and wife team taught Sunday school class where they explained evolution and said this is what scientists think about how things happened, that the Bible is an attempt by people that didn't know very much to explain how the world got to be the way it was. It's not a science book. There's science, there's the Bible. Nice. So I got a much better explanation of evolution in Sunday school than in high school biology.
Great.
So I thought one of the things that if you have questions, it would be great to address one of us and ask us about something that maybe came up earlier in one of the talks, or something that you wondered about, or how you would answer or deal with a particular question. But I'd like Sid to talk about how you approach that with your flock, or how you want to deal with to talk about it.
And I want to tell a story quickly too. When I was in about 4th grade, my mother said to me, "Are you learning about evolution in science?" And I said, "What's that?" And my mother was not a scientist, but she wanted me to learn about it. She said, in her very short version, "It's the idea that we come from monkeys." And I said, "Really?" She said, "Yeah, look, don't they kind of look like us?" I said, "Yeah, they kind of do."
That's great.
And she said, "So I want to make sure you're being taught that."
Wow.
And I said, "Well, no." But it did come. And then she went on with her own version of, she was one of those people that raised her children to question everything. But she still held on to certain ideas from the Bible, for instance, as being true, but she had rationalizations for them. So her common rationalization was, and I'm sure you've heard this, well, you know, it says there were 6 days of creation, but it doesn't say how long a day was. It could have been billions of years. And so that was her sort of way to bridge those worlds together. My way has been very different, but I really appreciate that she was that kind of a mother to raise those questions at a very young age, and to question whatever teaching was going on out there that didn't raise those kinds of questions. That I'm very thankful for. My own view is that I'm not a scientist at all. but I loved what you said. That was fascinating. The most I venture into DNA is through genealogy, which I'm really into because I love history, but I don't understand it from a scientific perspective. But I do love mythology, and I think that what I love about mythology is that it's a window into cultural development, and it provides a glimpse at what different cultures at different times are thinking. So I'm interested in mythology, but also from the historical perspective, to try to understand what was going on in their thinking, and then to make the transfer to today, where it doesn't always transfer, but there are often common human themes, even if the mythology was radically different. And so I see the creation stories, the Bible, and much of the Bible as mythology, but that doesn't devalue it for me. I find it's a rich field for learning, in the same way that you would have with literature. The only exception with general literature is that the Bible, and Christianity in particular, is used so often to beat up people. And it's used to counter science, or try to counter science. And so for that reason, it carries more weight in our society, culturally, than Shakespeare or Madame Bovary or whatever. All those are important, but you usually don't walk away with childhood wounds psychologically from Shakespeare. Did you? I'm
To
sorry
be or
hear
not to
that,
be.
Steve.
Hamlet almost did me in.
This guy needs work. So for me, that's the fun piece of this, and that's what I enjoy doing. So when someone who's a creationist walks up to me, and I didn't hear you earlier, Clare, but Steve relayed a little bit of what you said, and there's a part of me that resonates with I don't know what to say to a creationist. They want to argue, and I don't know. I don't see what they're talking about as true historically or scientifically, and so I don't even know how to have that discussion. If they want to talk about that story, their story, as myth, and the cultural context in which it was written, what may have been going on in their thinking, I'm there. But not as science, not as history. And so that's the perspective that I come from.
So, for example, last Sunday, how did you talk about it?
Last Sunday, and this is, my congregation pretty much believes the way I do on this stuff, so it would do no good to go through that. So this year I took the sort of a template from an article by Alan Lightman, and some of you may know his writing. He's a physicist, but he's also a lover. He tells wonderful stories. Einstein's Dreams, it's a wonderful little book where he tries to imagine Einstein coming up with multiple ideas of how time works when he was working in the patent office in Switzerland, and coming up with, and so each chapter is a new sort of fantasy scenario that draws from quantum physics, but is not. It's really story. It's playful. And then another one that he wrote called Mr. G, which is a more recent book, which is a fun sort of thing of blending mythology and the creation of the universe with the idea of God, but
As Mr. G.
as Mr. G.
Yeah.
But Lightman himself is an atheist. He's an atheist who feels an appreciation for literature. So I do want to, if you don't mind, just read a couple of clips that I used in my sermon Sunday to give you an indication of sort of the direction. One is how he categorized different ways of looking at religious beliefs and how God acts in the world. And I thought that this was a great sort of structure. At one extreme is atheism. God does not exist, period. Next comes deism, a prominent belief in the 17th and 18th centuries, and partly motivated to incorporate new scientific developments with theological thinking. Deism holds that God created the universe, but has not acted thereafter. Voltaire, a lot of our founding fathers and mothers were deists. Next comes immanentism, which is this idea that God created the universe and the physical laws and continues to act, but only through repeated application of those fixed laws. Is that? And while this differs philosophically from deism, it is functionally equivalent because God does not perform miracles in the world, and the central doctrine of science, the idea that there are consistent laws, and even as science unfolds, those laws of the universe, even if our paradigm is Newtonian and then someone like Einstein comes along and it's relativity, it's still based on the same principles. It's just our knowledge is expanded on how that works. Those laws, it does not counteract that. And then there's, and he says, one can argue that Einstein actually held that sort of view. He didn't think of God as a being, but he talked about the universe in spiritual metaphor often. So, but who knows? And then the last one finally comes what some theologians call interventionalism. From time to time, God can and does act to violate the laws. And those are the structures. And it's real interesting as you listen to people talk out in the culture, you'll hear people expressing all those views. I'll hear people that think of themselves as very progressive, politically, theologically, and they may not even use the word God because that pushes too many buttons. They may say the universe, but their theological framework is interventionalism. And so those folks who think of themselves as progressive are always surprised when I let them know that I am not an interventionalist. I'm not any of these other categories. I'm not an immanentist. I'm not a deist. I am, strictly speaking, by most definitions of atheism, an atheist. I just happen to love the mythology and the story of religion and believe that it has value, and that's what I'm all about. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is what he says that I found really interesting. He's talking about, in this article, it's by the way, you can find it on salon.com, and it's entitled, Does God Exist? And it's a case for reconciling the scientific with the divine and against the anti-religion of Richard Dawkins. And so even though he says, like Dawkins, he's also an atheist, like saying that, he believes that religion has value if it's used in helpful ways. And that's why I like this article, because that's pretty much my own perspective. And so he writes this. In my opinion, Dawkins has a narrow view of faith, but I would be the first to challenge any belief that contradicts the findings of science. But as I said earlier, there are things we believe in that do not submit to the methods and reductions of science. Furthermore, faith and the passion for the transcendent that often goes with it have been the impulse for so many exquisite creations of humankind. Consider the verses of various things. It's an Indian book that I don't even know, Gitanjali, the Messiah, the Mosque of the Alhambra, the paintings of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel? Would we take to task that Tagore and Handel and Sultan Yusuf and Michelangelo for not thinking? Faith in its broadest sense is about far more than belief in the existence of God or the disregard of scientific evidence. Faith is the willingness to give ourselves over at times to things we do not fully understand. He's not talking about something outside of science here. He's talking about the aesthetic, I believe, feeling, which can also be explained scientifically. But faith is the willingness to give ourselves over at times to things we do not fully understand. Faith is the belief in things larger than ourselves. Faith is the ability to honor stillness at some moments and at others to ride the passion and exuberance that is the artistic impulse, the flight of the imagination, the full engagement with this strange and shimmering world. And so I like that statement. He tells the story, and then I'll stop talking here. He and his wife have a summer home in Maine. And of course, he teaches physics at MIT, but he's there 3 months a year in Maine, and sometimes longer. And for years, they have observed a pair of osprey that have a nest just about 50 yards from their back porch. And he says, like scientists, we sit down with our notebooks and we observe everything. We observe the different chirps from the parents and what they mean. We see when the babies are hatched and the different commands, and we watch the flight patterns and everything that you can imagine that you would want to observe from a scientific perspective. And he says, and then we watch the babies, usually 2 or 3 a year, go off. And he says, and he said, my wife and I, like true geeks, we will sit down sometimes and read through our notebook and be so proud of our observations because they're so good and they're so precise and they're so scientific. And he says, one year there were 2 babies and we watched them. We knew that it was time for their first flight and we were ready for it. And we were standing on the back deck and we watched them come out of the nest. He says, now, to those babies, we must have looked like we were in a nest because they were watching us the whole time too. They were familiar with us. He said, and I was observing them as a scientist. But they flew out and they flew at full speed directly toward me. He says, and these were adolescents, but they had talents that could rip me to shreds. And for a moment, I thought that I was going to duck and cover. But I stood still. And as they flew toward me at full speed, he says, for about a half a second, we had eye contact. And then they shot up and flew away, circled around, went back to their nest. And when they left, he says, I stood there shaking with tears in my eyes. He says, those tears were not the tears of a scientist. They were the tears of communion, of connection. And that's what religion is. You don't have to believe in it as a mystical force outside of nature, but you can encounter the beauty and the mystery of nature itself and call that religion. So that's what I preached on Sunday. And because I think that those are 2 very different things. Now, you can explain from an evolutionary standpoint, if you're a scientist, not me, why he shook and how much of that had to do with what had emerged over billions of years that came into the form of human fight or flight, or the tears, that all those things can be explained. But why? Why explain that? we have poetry and metaphor and music and dance and art. And if religion is used the right way, religion, to address that. And so that's where I'm coming from. So I'll stop talking.
Okay, thanks.
What do you want to do?
Go for it.
Go
If
for
you have any reflections or
Uh-huh.
want to say, you're full of crap or anything.
Yeah, go
You're
ahead
full
and
of
tell me
crap.
I'm full of crap.
Yesterday on February 14th, I went to my wife and I say, I feel full of oxytocin. And she understood perfectly okay what I meant.
I love it.
No, I very much.
And she said, I know, you're full of something.
Yeah.
That's good.
Well, I wanted to comment on my background. So I was born and raised in Mexico City, 99.99% Catholic, right? So I was raised Catholic in a very loose, so my mother was religious, but not, we didn't go to church or much. So my encounter with religion and science were very much as most Catholics, I would say, are very separate domains. So schools in Mexico are very secular, or by law have to be secular, and so there's no mention whatsoever of religion in one way or another, positive or negative. So it's just, you just study the facts, your geometry, your language arts, and your science, period. And there's never a conflict. And I wish I had thought about this. Actually, I have our Bible, which it's all in Spanish, but it's the first several pages are an introduction to how the world came to be. And it talks about the Big Bang and about the formation of planets and suns and stars, and about the formation of the dinosaurs and then simians, and then humans came to be by evolution in my Bible. All right,
Wow.
so that was how I.
Pre-Genesis.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and then it goes to Genesis and everything, right? As a book of myth, and and where you are to take lessons and just think about the human condition, basically, right? So, because there's ugly things in there. There's a lot of beautiful poetry and stuff, but there's a lot of ugly stuff, right? It's human nature. We are fallen, if I were to use that language. So, to me, so I lost my religion not for a conflict between science and religion. It was more of a philosophical musings and readings, right? But so to me, it was a shock coming to the United States when I came as a graduate student and finding between people. I was first exposed to it by walking into the biology library. This was in California, and browsing through the journals, I saw a journal called little pamphlet, more than a journal, called Creation Evolution Journal. And I said, what? So I started browsing. It was the first issues published by the NCSE. When
The National Council for Science
the National Council for Science Education, because they had just formed around that time in the 80s, and they were beginning to work really strongly on all of those battleground lawsuits and decisions by the Supreme Court. So that was my first exposure. I just started reading that avidly because I couldn't believe what was going on. So I've been exposed
What
to
do you think
since.
of our Board of Education here in Texas?
Oh, he
Well,
spent a lot of
I-
time in the
Did you?
trenches. Yeah.
Yes,
Okay,
Both
good.
down there.
Good.
I believe so strongly that we as scientists have to become involved in it. That I've been putting my foot there all the time.
Well, that was interesting about the Bible, but I went to school at St. Stephen's here in Austin. I lived in Houston, but I got sent off to St. Stephen's for 8th grade, and we had ancient history class. The first book that we used was Man, His First Million Years, which is about fossils and stuff like that. So when we read through about human evolution, the next book was a thing called the Old Testament.
Whoa.
And we skipped all the BS at the beginning and went into all the things about the kings and the fights and all that stuff there. But so, I mean, that was an
So
interesting.
you skipped the first
We
part of the
skipped-
BS and went to the next BS.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
That's fascinating. So Claire, what about you?
Well, what's the question exactly?
The question is, what do you have to say about all this?
About all,
Here's an open-ended question.
it's supposed to be Darwin Day, right?
Yes, Darwin Day.
And so, but you've both talked about your religious intertwinings with science. So, and I do a lot of that already. So I'm at a loss. Do I want to cover that some more, or do I want to talk about Darwin? I don't know.
Yes, how about Darwin?
I don't know. Darwin?
Yeah. Go for it.
I'm not ready for this. Let's see.
Tell about his family.
It's like improv.
You know about his family?
Barnacles. Oh gosh, yeah. Where to start? Wow. I don't want to give a history lesson because
What's your favorite Darwin story?
my favorite Darwin story is how he came to be on the Beagle.
Huh.
How he. Well, actually, there's more than one. There's so many good ones. That he was supposed to help seal the notion that God created everything. And that's why he was recruited. He had been in seminary. And they felt that if they were going to find someone who was trained scientifically and in love with nature as much as he clearly was, that they needed him to be on this boat to go out there and seal the notion, once and for all, lay this to rest, that God did it all. And he went out with the intention of proving that hypothesis, I guess you could say. And he went out and he did what he did. He found the strata, and he found organisms that had clearly evolved from some predecessor, and so on and so forth, and put together his idea. And he hung on to it for years because he knew that it was going to be a difficult thing to sell. And another favorite story about Darwin is that one of the reasons that his theory of natural selection being the mechanism for evolution, one of the reasons it worked was because he was such a nice guy. He could sell it. And I have known many academicians, and the ones that are Darwin-esque are few and far between. And I admire those that can hang on to all that information and not get all bound up in ego and be impossible.
And
That
yet one of
works.
the reasons he held off for so long
He
in
was-
printing it is because he was concerned about his wife and a conflict of beliefs
Yeah.
that they shared, which is part
Yeah.
of what made him such
Yeah.
a nice guy.
Yeah, he was
You know?
he was deeply in love with his family. Deeply in love with his family. He is so polydimensional. And when Shirley Temple died, what everybody talked about was her lovely movies. Oh, and she was a diplomat. And if she were a man, it would be completely flipped. But when it comes to Darwin, for me, what makes him so wonderful is he's not just the hard scientist that you see the picture of. He was fully dimensional, very filled out, a loving, wonderful, active human being. And so he's not just a scientific hero, he's a personal hero. He's got all this dimension to him. And there's just so much to his life. I mean,
And part of his one-dimensional reputation comes from fundamentalist Christians.
which is, yeah,
Because they want to make him into some sort of demon to hate.
right.
Or they go the other way. They say that they have a lot of these deathbed conversion stories.
Yeah.
Which are just they did it for Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
They did it for Charles Darwin. It's Yeah.
If he did convert back to being religious, how does that bear on anything? It does not matter. His wife, who was deeply religious, was his editor. And so clearly it's possible to come up with a scientific theory and still be religious, which is another topic. But yeah, he's a fascinating person. If you can get hold of his biographies and his own recounting of his journeys, he's a fantastic writer. It's just good stuff.
There was a person that organized the Science in the Palace at UT where we talked. I was talking with him one night about someone that he knew in the lab that he admired as the best scientist that practical working scientist. However, this person was a young Earth creationist, and the work that he was doing was showing clearly evolution. And he was puzzled at how someone that was so bright and so able to stick to the scientific method was able to then go over into this other mind and think that the Earth was just 6,000 years old. But he said that the guy was astonishing in his ability to do science, but apparently that was not affected by having this other part of his being.
Yeah, I knew
Totally
a systematist who
separate.
was a young Earth creationist.
Really?
A systematist is somebody who studies the evolutionary relationships among organisms to determine who's most related to whom. So she's a systematist, and she was a young Earth creationist, and I said, how does this work? And she said, I believe what I'm discovering is God's patterns. So, that he created or something.
That's kind of that like the eminentist perspective that I
Yeah.
mentioned. It's not quite interventionalist.
But he had a very big, complicated plan, and yet elegant, and yet intelligent, and yet not so intelligent.
Huh.
It's
Interesting.
It's,
Yeah. Interesting.
It doesn't make sense, and the reason it doesn't make sense is because it's not true.
Do we have anybody out there that wants to witness or ask a question?
Any comment? Comment or question?
Yeah, Jim.
You're scaring me.
Stand up, brother.
You're scaring me. We don't use that kind of language here.
Watch your mouth.
I was going to say a couple of straight comments on the passage of light on the thread. I objected to the use of the word faith because that through the back door shovels all sorts of things that could be gotten at with other words. Covers two bases at once, but it didn't.
He does. He actually goes into much. I was reading just an excerpt. He goes into much more explanation of what that means. So you only got a Cliff Note version there. So
There's also, Clare talking about Darwin's biography, White in his autobiography, which started writing in 1876, it's a very remarkable passage that shows how White's tendency to censorship affected what the content of the autobiography was.
Right.
Talking about
Yeah.
is the passage where he talks about hell. The Christian doctrine is true as conventionally described, then my father, my brother, and all my best friends would right now be suffering eternal damnation. New paragraph, and that is a damnable doctrine in 1876. The passage wasn't published until 1958. And I've been wondering, someday when Google and other sources have all the English texts available for searching, I would love to know if damnable doctrine was ever used by anyone else with reference to a central Christian tenet. So I think it's a very brave thing to have said and right.
Yeah. Yeah. there. Amen. No, it's just, yeah.
Well, I have a question for you. So
Yes.
I'm curious about the group of people that come to your service. Will you describe them as like you, atheists, or of all different classifications according to that classification? And if there are some that are interventionists, how do they respond or relate to your speech?
Good question. I think we have people on all that spectrum within our congregation, and I think that what we share in common is sort of a value of the mythology. You would not find a single person here, for instance, who's a literalist when it comes to the Bible. You wouldn't find a single person here who believed that the creation stories were science. But you might find a few people that believe that miracles happen in a way that is somehow interrupts the laws of science. But they wouldn't be comfortable calling them miracles. They'd be more likely to use language of Course in Miracles or Marianne Williamson or Shirley MacLaine, which puts us nice square in the middle of Central Austin. And so I think that we have a lot of variation, but I think the one thing that they all value is the ability to question, and that we can be a community together working for justice and inclusiveness, but be differentiated when it comes to individual belief systems. If that makes sense. We don't need to be the same. They don't feel that they have to be the same as me. When I'm doing a sermon, I'm not saying, "Thus saith, this is the truth." I'm like, here's some musings, some thoughts. Will you come along with me on this journey for 20 minutes? And hopefully it'll give you some things to think about, and you can disagree or agree or whatever. But let's do that together. That's sort of the way I approach it. Does that make sense?
I've known you for at least 14 years, because when you spoke at First Unitarian Universalist Church, that's where I first met you.
Huh.
And then I've seen you speak in other places and over time. And when I think I was executive director when you came and spoke to CFI. In any case, what you were talking about at the end, I felt like he's an atheist and he just doesn't know it. And then I've seen you talk in your classes, and always the word atheism is avoided. And now I hear you saying, I'm essentially an atheist.
Mm-hmm.
Has that really evolved? Like I am getting the sedentary snapshots, or is it just that
I've said it all along. I realized my second year of seminary that in terms of how people usually define atheism,
right? Yeah.
That I'm an atheist, and it was a crisis for me because
I remember the crisis.
I was
You
in
talked about
seminary.
And you had a crisis because you couldn't believe in
Right.
stuff.
Right.
Oh.
And so I would say in a class or in a lecture that very clearly, I would talk around it, and it would be clear where I was coming from, but I wouldn't use that word. And the main reason is because I know that there are people that are coming there that are looking for a way to be in community, in religious community, without being beat up.
I was going to say bludgeoned, yeah.
And they're at all sorts of different places. And so I wanted to feel safe without it being inauthentic, but
Right.
safe.
No,
And so I feel like the myth and story and poetry, because it's a way to navigate that without that direct thing. But I've never hesitated to say a lecture setting within my own church. So it's not something that I've come to recently, but it's something that I don't say overtly in every context. Does that make sense?
it certainly
That
does.
may sound like I'm wishy-washy, but I've got a method in mind. So.
There's a young lady in the back wants to
Yes,
ask a
Rachel.
question.
So, since you have both sensibilities, you describe yourself as things that you have a religious sensibility, community, and everything, is there anything that atheists ever do or say that you find offensive? Like, I don't know, racing cars with Jesus, or,
I've probably got more of those than the atheists do.
or is there any comments or anything that you still find offensive?
I'll tell you, the thing that pushes my buttons more than anything is fundamentalism in any form. And I see any kind of absolutism as fundamentalism, whether it's using the language of religion or science. And I'm not discounting the what I talked about as the consistent law of science. But I think that as human beings, life is messy, and there's just a lot we don't understand. My own personal belief is that that we are we're sort of we're just messy, and so that kind of fundamentalism or rigidity, absolutism, it may be true in a scientific sense from some atheists, but I've never met a scientist that a deep scientist that was absolutist. It was all about the quest for new things unfolding, learning, and so I just think that we've got too much community stuff that we need to do in our world, too much injustice going on that needs to be interrupted with justice and compassion. And whether it's true or not, the way we posture ourselves creates the world that we live. And let's posture ourselves with grace and compassion, embracing ambiguity, and that's sort of where I'm coming from.
You may have heard of Richard Dawkins, and he created a scale. 1 is an absolute believer in a God and the personality, and a 7 is an absolute non-believer. So you have fundamentalists on both ends.
Yes.
And he's often accused of being this very hostile, aggressive atheist, but he puts himself as a 6, somebody who
Yes.
philosophically understands that we don't have absolute knowledge. And if you say that you have absolute knowledge of what isn't there, then you are just as fundamentalist as the one who is absolutely sure that there is something there. And so, I think he gets a bum rap a lot.
Yeah.
Now, he is kind of an asshole some of the times, particularly when certain things having to do with gender roles come up.
just a little bit. Little bit.
Wow, really?
And so there are some things about him. I mean, he's not Saint Dawkins.
Yeah.
We don't have saints in science. We have people that some of them know what they're talking about more than others. And some of them are scientists in one field and they make idiot statements about other fields. And I think, did you mention Behe? Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
guy from Lehigh University, and his science department actually put a disclaimer that we don't agree with this guy's ideas about stuff, because he is a intelligent design
Advocate.
scientist. He does work on, I believe, what is it?
No,
Biochemicals.
he doesn't work on
He
it.
doesn't work on it.
He just writes
He
about
writes
it.
about it. I see.
Very different.
Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that.
So that, Rachel, I think that, thank you, Steve, because I think that's what I would say, is when I come across those 1s or those 7s, they push my buttons the same way. It doesn't matter if they're using religious language or secular language, it still does this with me, and I want to just sort of punch their balloon full of holes. So.
And we have people within the secular community that I don't know why they're so hostile. Maybe they were mistreated by their religion when they were, and they've gotten out of it, and now they just are madder than hell. And I know a couple of people that would not come to a talk here because it's
here.
a church.
Yeah.
You know?
Sure.
So they miss out on the good stuff. That's all I can say. Jim has got another comment. Stand up, brother. Let us hear it.
Sing it.
Thanks, Steve, for explaining what the A on Dawkins really means.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So this is a question
Funny.
about mainstream Christianity in its current form. It seems like it very much has a persecution complex problem. Do you think that's driving some of the fundamentalism that we're seeing?
I don't know if it's driving it. I don't know the answer to that question. I think fundamentalism.
Manufactured situation,
Yeah.
because we have here a social movement that is not a minority in the population, and yet they're being told that they are the minority and that they feel like they're suffering from the secular movement, when in reality they are outnumbering any of us. Right?
they're-
So I think it's a manufactured feeling of persecution.
That's
Who's
a good
pushing
answer.
that idea? Is there any media outlet that might be pushing that idea?
I
Particular
wonder.
network.
Might start with F and with X.
That's right. Yeah.
What was another one that you with J now?
I would suggest reading very firstly the book by Fire Atheist or Angry.
Yeah.
Why not? My question is about, if you're familiar with this guy, Dr. Michael Jones, with the New Covenant group, he has some ideas that seem kind of similar to yours.
Never heard of him. Interesting.
There are almost there is a podcast, a video podcast that always have atheists on. That's what they do. They like to reach out to atheists. This guy's really impressive about
Interesting. They need to call themselves something different. That the new covenant even pushes my buttons, just because it sounds like, whoa, stay away from that. Sort of manifest destiny kind of thing.
Yeah.
He kicks aside him and other whatever off the show. Smart show.
I find that one of the things I see with my fellow clergy, many of them are as liberal as me, but they will never let their congregations know that, because they're scared of it politically, for their salary and all sorts of their job. And so, but there's also a level of contempt that I pick up toward lay people. What they'll say is that I don't think lay people can handle that. And my feeling is, I bet those lay people pick up on their contempt, because I sure would. I sure do. And what I find is that people are hungry for wrestling with stuff. and being able to talk about it truthfully. It was probably 15 years ago that I finally got the courage on an Easter Sunday to say that I have no doubt that early Christians experienced in some way what we call the resurrected Christ. But I in no way believe that it was a resuscitated body, floating spirit, or anything interventionalist that happened outside of nature. It may have happened in the imaginations of the community. It may have happened out of grief. I don't doubt that it didn't happen for their lives. But there could be people sitting right next to them that wouldn't have had the same experience. And I remember just sort of unpacking that and thought, there are a lot of visitors here who don't know who we are, and they probably won't be back next week. But the reaction I got from my congregation was unbelievable. It's like, finally, we're talking about this stuff. And so I think there's a hunger for just being able to unpack stuff like that.
One of the problems we in the secular community have is not being able to actually have a community like this so much. I mean, there are some places where it happens, but really, I mean, there are so many churches where they can say, well, if you don't go to church, you're going to hell. And, we can't very well do that. We can't scare the crap out of people and make them come and pay their 10% or whatever.
I have the same problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. I say, we want your 10%, but because if you don't pay it, you'll have more money. You'll have more money to go to dinner. You can go to Europe for vacation. Yeah. If you don't do it, that's what will happen.
Or you'll be Catholic and feel guilty.
Yeah.
This looks like a church, feels like a church, sounds like a church. I drive by and say, there's another church. What's the point?
I think the point's different for everybody. For me, it has to do with community. Sort of the human need, for some humans, not all, for ritual, consistency, common language for working for justice. Those are my answers. But everybody has a different answer to that.
I'm sorry for being, what's the name of the church?
Trinity United Methodist, which was the name that they got because in 1946, when they put their stained glass windows in their old sanctuary, these 3 windows, they hadn't come up with a name for themselves, and they decided that with their 3 of them, we'll call ourselves Trinity. And so no deep theological reason for that. They just thought they were pretty.
I think it's going to be an interesting phenomena as more and more people lose their faith. What's going to happen? Because the way I perceive things, most atheists right now are very independent-minded, and there's social groups, small social groups, but by and large, as the well-used refrain goes, getting atheists together is like herding a herd of cats, right? So, but as this phenomena grows through the population, I think a lot of people, maybe not all the time, but in some stages of our life, we do seek communion, social communion with other people, and be able to engage in ritual and tradition. And that's what churches have provided for centuries, right? So it's easy for churches to plug into that human need that some of us have, some of us don't, some of us will have at some time. So my understanding or my prediction, my hypothesis model would be that, as we grow that churches like yours will be more prevalent, and that they will be able to recruit the people that just want to be able to just engage with other human beings in this type of interaction, which is happening in many places, right? In England, there's the Sunday Assembly,
They had the first
and
one
some in
Austin,
Austin.
on February.
Ah, I didn't know.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's growing.
It was, yeah, it was last, wait a minute, but, I don't know, anyway, it was, or the first Sunday this month, I think. Second Sunday this month. Okay, whatever.
There's an author that
Yeah, the 8th.
named oh, now I'm blanking on his name. Ronald Grimes. He teaches. He's an atheist, but he teaches ritual studies at a small university in Canada. But he's written several. I've read 3 books of his on ritual, and he looks at it not from a religious standpoint, but from an anthropological study, historical study, and talks about, sort of back on the heels of some people like Joseph Campbell and Eliade and some others who've studied shamanism and culture, and he really believes that religions evolved at a core place in our anthropological history, when we were gathered around the fire and when we were dealing with real life issues of the cycles of life, as well as the cycles of the season, and prayers and survival, and it all came out of that. And it's a relatively new era in religion, where it's organized into religious groups. That animist primal thing is still there. And what I see is that as people become more and more disenfranchised from organized religion and the dogma and the beliefs that have become core to that, and I think a lot of that is very good to keep that as a distance. I often find that I have much more in common with atheists than I do with religious people for that reason. But I also believe what Grimes says is that even if you're non-religious, just in our human community, there arises times when we need a rite of passage, some way to ritualize stepping through this particular threshold, whether it's birth, coming of age, driver's license, getting married, death, whatever. We have this need. And so one of the things that I think that is going to need to happen, whether it happens in religious communities or in secular contexts, is that whether it's religious or not, as religion or faith or not, as is talked about today, we are likely to have a need, just from a pure anthropological perspective, of some way to walk together, and I'm using metaphor here, walk together as community through rites of passage. That's to me. That's and so if a religion can address those core issues, then it gets back to what it originally was, and I would like to see it do that without the magical interventionalist perspective. That would be, but I don't think that's going away. I think it's still there. I see it when an atheist friend of mine calls me up and says, "Sid, my husband is dying, and we want a funeral. We don't want it to be religious, and that's why we're calling on you." And I say, "What do you want?" And what they're describing is the core elements of a religious service without the religion. And so there's a part of me that says, why. And the why, I think, goes back to something that's in our development
Social
anthropologically. That's my sense of that.
In our mitochondria.
In our mitochondria, probably. One of those viruses that got stuck in there, you know.
I'd like to thank everybody for showing up, and I would like to ask a favor. I think we need to kind of break up.
Yep.
And those blue chairs, and there's 3 white tables out in that hallway, they need to be brought back in here, and the chairs need to be put around the tables. There's 1 here, and then 4 here.
We can set the tables up.
So if you wouldn't mind helping, that would be great. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.